Welcome to the Classic City Sports Podcast.
And McAllister down the left field line. Connor Tate is going to round third. He will score. And rounding third is Blaylock. He will score. And the Dogs walk it off.
If you're looking for the latest Georgia Bulldog news in football, basketball, baseball, and recruiting, then you are in the right place.
It's third down, Bryce Young's career. You need 10, play clock at 4. From the pocket, launching downfield, underthrown and intercepted. Keely Ringo has an escort down the sidelines. All the way to the end zone, and Georgia is going to conquer the Crimson Tide.
Hosted by Jeremiah Stoddard and Jonathan Williams.
Georgia on the mountaintop. Demons be gone, and the drought is over. National champions at long last.
Just sit back, relax, and prepare yourself for these hot takes you're about to listen to.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Classic City Sports Podcast. As always, Jeremiah Stoddard and Jonathan Williams here for you. Every week we come back and I started off by saying it's another action-packed episode for you, and guess what it is? We haven't done an episode since Dylan Raiola committed, so we've obviously got to talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of Georgia, stuff being thrown around in the national media stuff, different stuff with Barstool and Brandon Walker, all that kind of stuff out there. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on the national media side of everything. Then we got to talk, just recruiting in general, right? That's obviously got to go on. And there's also some comments being made out there about Sanford Stadium and the type of stadium and environment that it is. So we're going to try to hit on all of this kind of stuff. So make sure you stick around with us for the next 30 to 45 minutes. We'll try to hit on as much of that as possible. Jonathan, I'm going to start off with you. How are we feeling today?
A little tired, honestly. I started my summer job, if you will, that I always have throughout the summer. If you are a consistent viewer, you know this. Yep, working with Grandpa. Got a blue-collar job in the summer. The rider / blue-collar worker, I guess you want to put it, during the summertime. So that started, and boy, was I baptized by fire this week. I got right back to it, and it's been a rough start. But, always juice for the podcast episode. Got to get the vibes right, and I did get the vibes right for the episode. So really excited for that. Excited to be back after you had to take a week off last week because you were out doing your other job, and you were taking care of business there. So excited to be back. Excited to talk about Dylan Raiola finally, bring that news. And then also excited to kind of debunk all of this nonsense that's been going on in the media and kind of explain why Sanford Stadium is like Mr. Misunderstood. Shout out to Eric Church. Why Sanford Stadium continues to be misunderstood and why people continue to label it as this mid environment when it's the complete opposite of that, and especially I'm excited to talk about that segment because you and I both have experienced Sanford Stadium on different levels. We've experienced the cupcake games, the UAB games, noon kickoffs against UAB. We've experienced those, but we've also experienced the 3:30 kickoff against Tennessee last year. So we've gotten like the high-end, high-energy games, and then we've also gotten
against Auburn, all that kind of stuff, man.
So you and I have seen it all. So I think that you and I can really provide some great perspective to that, and I'm just juiced all around for this. I'm excited to talk about Georgia's recruiting because they've been wreaking havoc. So I'm just ready to get after it, man.
Absolutely. It's going to be a good episode with you. But let's go ahead and jump into the national media part of it. Everything that's coming out, everybody always talking about it. One thing that keeps being talked about that I see all the time is the Georgia football schedule, right? Like they call it the cupcake schedule overall. They say it's a weak strength of schedule, all that good stuff, right? Well, at the end of the day, they're still playing in the SEC and they play SEC football teams 8 times during the season, right? That's not, some of those games, one game's against Vanderbilt. You get Florida in there who's not going to be so great this year. There's South Carolina who's going to be a middle of the pack type team, maybe a little upper level. Kentucky we're not entirely sure about. But my point of it is you got teams like even Georgia Tech out there talking about the schedule, right? Well, guess what? You're an out-of-conference game that's an ACC opponent, and you're part of what makes the schedule so crappy. And that's not very helpful. And so you can talk about it all you want, but you're contributing to the fact that this is not a very good schedule. But if you look at our schedule versus, say, a Georgia Tech who plays against an all ACC schedule and some out of conference, if you take away the Georgia game off their schedule, what does their schedule look like? I mean, it's you play like North Carolina, you play Clemson, who's not very good anymore. Like there's not a bunch of, you play like Pitt, that kind of stuff, like games like that. Like that's not, you don't get to talk about Georgia's strength of schedule when your conference in general, from top to bottom, even if you put it next to Georgia's schedule for this season, it's not looking great. And most people focus on the out of conference game. You look at like the Ball States and Murray States, that type of game that's on the schedule for Georgia, right? I get it, but at the same time, do you expect Georgia to go schedule 4 games against top 25 opponents in their offseason? Plus, these games that are out of conference, outside of the fact that you play Georgia Tech every single year, the out of conference games that you play, those are scheduled, like the big ones are scheduled years and years in advance, right? You're supposed to have Oklahoma on the schedule on the road by chance, like, just an FYI this year, but it got taken away because they're coming to the SEC and they made us cancel that game. You're not going to sit here and schedule 4 out of conference opponents that are top 25 every time. Everybody else gets cupcake games. Why are we not going to take those? It's not our fault that Florida is not looking so good this year. Vanderbilt's always bad. Missouri's not great. Like, it's not our fault that the SEC itself has a couple of teams that we play that aren't so great. It is what it is, man. But like you've pointed out on Twitter, by the end of the season, guess what? Last year was a cupcake schedule, right? By the end of the season, after Georgia goes to the playoffs, after Georgia plays all of those teams in the SEC championship, all that good stuff, they have like the hardest strength of schedule when it's all said and done. Guess what? They went 15-0 last year. That's all you need to know.
Yeah, you're over here stepping on my toes because that's exactly what I was about to say. And I like Dan's comment. Our schedule sucks because you suck. That's exactly what it is. Georgia can't help who they have on the schedule. They play the same teams pretty much every single year, outside of the one Western Division opponent that they rotate in and out every single year. And then, of course, the FCS opponents, the group of 5 teams that they rotate into the schedule every now and then as well. Those flip-flop. But other than that, the beef of the schedule stays the same. You're going to get Tennessee, you're going to get Florida, you're going to get all those Eastern Division opponents. And sometimes you're going to get Alabama on the schedule. Sometimes you're going to get Ole Miss on the schedule like this year. And then sometimes it's going to be one of the lesser end SEC West opponents. It just depends on what the cycle is and what the schedule is. But you're exactly right to that point of Georgia has ended up having the toughest schedule anyways at the end of the year. And that's why this offseason talk about the schedules is nonsense anyways, because there's always going to be a team that is better than anyone expected. There's always going to be a team like Arkansas in 2021 that goes into Athens as a top 10 opponent. Now, I know they didn't finish there, but they were playing really good football at the time. Team. They were a lot better than what people expected them to be under Sam Pittman. There's always going to be a team like that. Tennessee last year exceeded expectations. Yep. People kind of expected Tennessee to arrive shortly, but I don't think they expected them to arrive as quickly as they did last year. And that ended up being arguably the best game of the entire college football season last year between those two. At least if you're a Georgia fan, they would argue that. So that's exactly my point is there's no reason to debate schedules right now because Ole Miss very well could be a top 15 team by the time they play Georgia and come into Sanford Stadium. And that very well could be one of the biggest games of the season, And Tennessee very well could be inside of the top 5 again. So you just never know how things are going to shake out. I don't think many people predicted LSU to win the West last year. It's so unpredictable to sit here even before the month of June is here and say like, oh, well, their schedule already sucks. You just don't know. And then Georgia, a program like Georgia is going to get tested at some point. When you are as good as Georgia, when you run the East like Georgia has every single year, you are going to get tested at some point, whether that's in the SEC championship game or whether that's in the college football playoff or even in a New Year's Six bowl. You are going to get tested at some point. So why are we sweating over it? Why are we sitting here complaining about Georgia's schedule saying like, oh, woe is me, they get an easy schedule when chances are, 1, your team is on that schedule, so you're probably part of that reason. 2, they're going to get tested at some point anyways. It's not necessarily just an absolute cakewalk all the way to Atlanta every single year. It's going to happen. And 4, if they win, or 3, if they win that national championship anyways, then dang, it didn't seem like the schedule mattered anyways because they were the best team in college football. And that's why the schedule is what it is, because Georgia is the best team in college football. And that's why their schedule does look so weak, because Georgia's up here and all the other teams are like maybe in the middle and then some down here on your tippy toes. Like, man, it's sweating over a schedule in the month of May is just ridiculous to me. It makes no sense. Schedules are going to work out the way they work out.
This is why they focus on the schedule right now, and they're making that what they can talk about at Georgia, because what else can they talk about Georgia? Recruiting at a top 3 level every single season, back-to-back national championship games, development from, you just had a 2-star former walk-on quarterback be a Heisman finalist, throw for 4,100 yards, and get drafted higher than they've had any quarterback get drafted since Aaron Murray back in 2013, 14, whatever year that was. They've got nothing left to talk about. What they can say now is, well, guess what? They've got a cupcake schedule, so of course they're going to be at the end of the season. No, nobody talks about the fact that Clemson always has a cupcake schedule, and they were in the playoffs every single year. Oklahoma has a cupcake schedule every single year. That's why they were in the playoffs every single year. And then you have Ohio State. Who do they play? They play Michigan and Penn State, but Penn State's not all that. Like, we saw a really bad Auburn team go to like a final second decision against them just 2 seasons ago or whatever it was. Teams like that don't get the same crap that Georgia does, because that's all they can talk about with Georgia at this point. Guess what? All those other teams have in common that I just listed. They get in the playoffs and they lose. Lincoln Riley and Oklahoma would get there, four years in a row, lost all first rounds, never made a national championship, didn't win a single playoff game. Georgia gets there. They go against Ohio State in a just absolute dogfight, and then they win the game. That's the difference. You have team like Georgia gets there and they can win that next game and go to a national championship game and win it. These other teams like Clemson, like Oklahoma, and other teams of that nature that get to the playoffs every single time, it feels like. And I know Clemson wasn't there last year. They kind of fell off. I get that. Oklahoma fell off a little bit as well. Lincoln Riley left. Caleb Williams left. All that. I got it. But guess what? Next year, we're going to be talking about the fact that a USC could be making the playoffs because they were not too far off last year, and they're going to add some extra talent because Lincoln Riley's recruiting well. He's going to get some transfer guys in there, and they're going to have a cupcake schedule. They're going to get into the playoff type scenario. They're going to be right on the borderline. I'm not saying they're going to make it yet, but they're going to be right there, right? Nobody's going to talk about their schedule being weak. Who'd they play last year? Everyone praised them because they went from 4-8 the year before to being almost a conference champion and a potential playoff team. Who'd they play? They didn't play anybody all year long. And then they lost the games that they played somebody good. They ain't play nobody. And then as soon as they played against Utah, which Florida beat, by the way, they lost twice. But Georgia doesn't get the same credibility of their schedules. It's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, it is what it is. Georgia's going to get there and win at the end of the day, and it's not going to matter. But it's just kind of the only thing they can say as an opposing fan base.
Yeah, and Big Dog, you also make a great point. The schedules are made years in advance. At least some of the games are. Yes. And also, shout out to you. I saw you give a shout out to Detroit City. So, heck yeah, love to see that. But yeah, I believe Georgia scheduled their game with Florida State, which I believe starts in 2028. And then the following year, 2029, a home and home. That was scheduled in 2019. So 10 years in advance, pretty much. They scheduled that game. And we have no idea what Georgia is going to look like in 10 years. Sitting back in 2019 from that perspective. Yeah. Stoddard does love throwing that in everybody's face, doesn't he? Anyways, going back to my point. We have no idea what Georgia is going to look like 10 years from now. We have no idea what Florida State is going to look like for 10 years from now. You hope that both Florida State and Georgia remain where they are right now, where Florida State is looking like they're going to contend for the ACC and maybe even a playoff spot, and Georgia is going to remain at the top of college football, and you get a top 10 matchup when they do play in both years. But you just don't know what could happen. College football is ever changing. Every single year, things are changing. Coaches are changing, so much change all the time. It's a whirlwind. The news cycle, it's always happening. And so you just anything can happen. And that's kind of sometimes what happens. Just like when we scheduled that game with Oklahoma, we didn't know they were going to be in the SEC. Nobody would.
They also didn't know they weren't going to be so good right now, because when we scheduled that game, guess what? They were making the freaking playoffs. They still had Lincoln Riley. You don't know what's going to happen in 4 years. Georgia does have, like you were saying, they've got Clemson on the schedule coming up. They got Florida State coming up. They've got Ohio State is on the schedule as well. They scheduled Oregon. Guess what? After Oregon lost to Georgia,
UCLA is on the schedule.
Yeah, UCLA is on the schedule coming up. So they've got good teams out there that are scheduled in advance. You don't know how well they're going to be playing the year you actually find them, and it is what it is.
So I can't wait when 2028 rolls around and the comments are going to be, Georgia has to play Florida State. What a weak schedule! Like as if that was the plan all along. Like
Florida
we
State's getting better. I
we
hope they are
scheduled
good
Florida
when they
State
play
in
'em.
2019, knowing that they would potentially suck in 2028. Like get out of here, man! It's just ridiculous. So had to bring that into the spotlight a little bit. Had to kind of poke fun of that and just basically say like you're wasting your time if you're arguing about it. If you're on Twitter and you're talking about strength of schedule in the month of May. What are you doing? Like, go to your 9 to 5, go do what you're supposed to be doing, and get off freaking Twitter because obviously you have better things that you need to be doing. But now we're going to get into some other things, some bigger stuff, Georgia focused stuff. Dylan Raiola, number 1 overall prospect in 2024, number 1 quarterback, obviously as well, commits to Georgia Stoddard. Now, this isn't the first time that Kirby Smart and his staff have landed like one of these top echelon quarterbacks in a class. There was Justin Fields, which I know, sensitive topic, but still, it's worth noting. Actually, is this still to this day the highest rated recruit that Georgia's ever landed. Dylan Raiola is now number 2, just ahead of Nolan Smith, who just graduated and went to the NFL. So a lot of good names right there. So a huge day there. And that only wasn't a big day knowing that Georgia was going to be getting Dylan Raiola and one of the best quarterback in the nation. It also was big because everybody knew that wherever Dylan Raiola went, it was going to start drawing a lot of attraction from other recruits across the nation. There was talk about which recruits were linked to Dylan Raiola, which ones were kind of looking to see where he went before they popped their decision. Some that have already made their decision, but are still kind of like, ooh, Dylan Raiola's in Athens. Maybe I need to flip on over there and I need to head south myself as well. But now Georgia is already starting to get recruits, guys that are committing to Georgia as a result of it. Now, some of them you can't exactly say are a direct result of Dylan Raiola. Some of them are just really good football players that probably may have ended up at Georgia anyways. Right. But like today, Jaden Riddell, tight end. Some consider him the number 1 tight end in the class. That seems like a byproduct of Dylan Raiola coming to Georgia. There was a lot of teams in the mix for him. Tennessee was in the mix a little bit. So him coming to Athens, that's a big deal. Todd Hartley, a freaking menace on the recruiting show. That man is a dude. He is getting it done, continues to thrive in Athens. You get the number 1 punter in the nation in Drew Miller, which was kind of out of left field. You always take that. Shout out to special teams. I know Zach and all of you people in the comments that have been begging for special teams talk. There you go. We just mentioned it for you. You got some special teams talk on the podcast. And then you have another tight end, Colton Heinrich. That's another big get. Todd Hartley in Georgia really seemed to like this guy.
He don't miss,
man. He really don't. And then Marcus Harrison, all the way up from New York. I think the last time Georgia got maybe a player. I know offensive lineman from New York was Isaiah Wilson, right?
Yes.
Isaiah Wilson.
Right. I think it was Isaiah
Wilson. And this dude is the definition of the Big Apple because he is 6'7", 336 pounds. Big old mamma jamma. That is a big dude. So a good get for the offensive line and Stacy Searles. You always like to buy insurance for your number 1 overall quarterback. And so that's exactly what they got there. So a lot of recruiting news over the past couple of weeks, really. So Stoddard, just kind of give me your thoughts on that. I know I just listed a whole lot of names. There's a lot to unpack, but man, give me your thoughts. Like, walk me back to you talking about Dylan Raiola and finding out like, oh, he is actually coming to Georgia. Like this is happening. What do you think that means for Georgia?
Well, as far as what it means for, it's huge for Georgia, right? Georgia hasn't had a quarterback recruit this high in a very long time. Obviously, like you said, since like Justin Fields, we've had some really good quarterbacks come into this class at Georgia as well. You've had, your Jacob Easons, you had your Jake Fromms, who were decent, like highly rated. You've had your Gunnar Stockton's commit. You've had your Brock Vandegrift, 5 stars, that kind of thing. But you haven't had a guy that was the number 1 quarterback in the nation in a long time. And we never really got to see what the last one could do because that was all the stuff. You had Jake Fromm coming off a national championship, all that. And then it was just kind of a tough spot for a kid to be thrown into to overtake it. Is what it is. He went on. He did well. He moved on to the next level. We move on as well. Now we get to see what's going to happen with the next one that is a highly rated guy, because I think I texted you this the other day when it happened. Or not long after it happened. And I said, Raiola's probably not going to start as a freshman. I stand by that. I think that that's a high possibility that he is not a starter his freshman year. And because Georgia does things differently. Their system is very pro style, very complicated. There's a lot to learn for a quarterback. going from high school to college in general is very difficult for these quarterbacks, especially when you go into that type of system, especially the type of system that Todd Monken has left at Georgia. It takes guys a long time to get comfortable to that and be ready to go and start. Even Carson Beck said the year that everyone thought he was going to start when, before that UAB game, and you ended up getting Stetson Bennett in, what was that, 21? He said he wasn't ready. He said he was not ready, or that was 2020. He said he wasn't ready yet. So
no, UAB
no 21,
brother.
21. Sorry, that was
freaking
I'm getting
old
the years
man over
confused.
here.
I'm
He's a
telling
little
you, man.
senile.
But
I apologize, everyone.
Point being, he says he wasn't ready yet in that system. So everyone that's probably assuming that Dylan Raiola is going to come in here day one and be ready to go, I think you're going to be, a little disappointed, and you're going to have a lot of fans out there talking about put him in. You got to trust the process, got to trust the coaching staff on it to know what they are doing. Because guess what? You still have Brock Vandagriff on the roster potentially, and he could still be here next year. You got Gunnar Stockton, who will most likely be here next year. You still have Ryan Puglisi, who is going to be a freshman as well, and he's not the highest rated recruit out there. He's still a 4-star, and he still looks really good as of now, and he's ready to come play ball at Georgia. So a lot of people are going to assume that Raiola is going to come in there and just start immediately. And I don't think that's going to be what you see. And I want Georgia fans to temper their expectations year one. Now, I'm not saying he's not going to come in and he's not going to light it up when he gets his chance. And maybe he could take it over year one. He could be able to absorb it all. But you shouldn't be expecting him to do that. You're setting yourself up for disappointment. You're setting yourself up to be frustrated with the coaching staff. But at the same time, I wasn't really surprised once it was all said and done to see Raiola come to Georgia because of the connections with Matthew Stafford. Everyone was focusing on that. Mike Bobo had connections with him. Everyone said, well, Georgia went to Mike Bobo so quick after Todd Monken left. Part of that was probably because he knew that he had a connection to Raiola, and Georgia wanted to try to make sure they could nurture that and get that to go the rest of the way. But when I saw Raiola commit, I was extremely excited. I'm really excited to see what he can do at Georgia overall. I think he has a very, very high ceiling, and I think he has a pretty high floor as well. I think that even at his worst, he's going to come in and he's going to play well in Georgia's system. Maybe he doesn't leave as, the all-time passing leader at Georgia or something like that. Maybe he doesn't throw for 4,400 yards or 4,200 yards and break Stetson's passing record this year. I don't know. But he very well could throw for 4,500 yards at Georgia. He could throw for 40 touchdowns, that kind of thing. He's got the talent and the ability to do that. And in the system that Georgia has, if he can develop into it and get comfortable, you could see some very, very special things out of that kid.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Ryan Puglisi because I think that's also someone that Georgia fans should be stoked about, especially if you paid any attention to what we released on Dogs Daily at SI.com about Ryan Puglisi, like right after Dylan Raiola committed. Of course, we want to know, like, what's Ryan Puglisi thinking? Like, what's he doing? We've asked him that question before, like, hey, if Dylan Raiola comes, what happens to Ryan Puglisi? And he's always said, I'm a dog. Like, I'm staying here. I'll be in Athens. And I thought it was great that when Brooks messaged him and he asked him, like, hey, it just happened. Like, I got to ask. And he's like, dude, you already know my answer. He's like, I'm a dog. I am a bulldog. That is who I'm going to be. That is where I'm going to be. That's what fans should be also really excited about, is the fact that not only do you get the number one quarterback in the nation, but you got another guy that a lot of programs around the nation consider to be a top 5 quarterback in this class that wants to come in and compete and push Dylan Raiola and fight for a spot. So you get both ends of the spectrum. You get two really good football players, 2 really good quarterbacks that are going to be going head to head as soon as they set foot on campus. That's great. That's great that you get that automatic competition and you really get to find out who's the better quarterback, and someone has to go in there and take that job. It's not just given to Dylan Raiola. He's going to have to take that job.
Nothing's better for a quarterback room than competition, man.
Yeah,
legit competition. Exactly. Nothing's better for a quarterback room than that.
Yeah. But so do want to touch on some other, like, some names that it seems like maybe they're kind of trending a little bit Georgia's way now that Dylan Raiola is in Athens, at least for now. They may not actually end up at Georgia, but it seems like there's been a lot of buzz around these names. These 2 specifically, I would say, it seems like obviously there's a lot of recruits out there that probably want to come to Georgia. Of course, they win the national champions, back-to-back number 1 program in the nation, Kirby Smart, etc. But Mike Matthews being one of them, Parkview, Georgia, really good 5-star wide receiver. And then also Jeremiah Smith, who is currently committed to Ohio State. But might be thinking about some other options, especially when you look at some of the comments he has made saying like, well, yeah, of course, Dylan Raiola going to Georgia changes things a little bit. Like, yeah, I'm paying attention to that. That definitely opens my eyes a little bit. And yeah, it's got me thinking. So those things stand out. But, so I hit the recruiting trail for the first time ever in my career as a writer. I hit the recruiting trail with Brooks last week, I think it was. Yeah, it was last week. And I got to go to Parkview and I got to go see Mike Matthews up close, was repping the Georgia gloves. Shouts out to that. You always love to see that in practice. Got to look at him. Obviously stands out. It was so funny because because I'm kind of new to the recruiting game or the scouting game, so-called, Brooks is like, all right, your job is to go out here and you're going to walk around this field and you're going to report back to me and you're going to tell me who are the Power 5 football players, who is going D1, who is going to one of these big schools. You got to find the athletes. And when we got to Parkview, I was like, well, there's one right there. And I pointed to Mike Matthews like, that's a wife scout, as Brooks would call it. So beautiful football player, like just uber athletic, super smooth. And, it seemed like he was probably going to stay in the orange colors at the time when he was when we were there. Like it seemed like, okay, he's probably not going to end up at Georgia. He's kind of trending elsewhere. And then all of a sudden, Dylan Raiola comes to Georgia. And now it's like Mike Matthews, Georgia might be a fit now. That might be happening now. That might be in the plans for Mike Matthews. It's just crazy to think about like what this opens. I said it in a tweet. I was like, this is not just the number one player in America committing to Georgia when Dylan Raiola committed to Georgia. This changes everything. This makes it to where Georgia's 2024 recruiting class might be the best in history, the most talented in history, the most loaded recruiting class in history because of things like this, because of Mike Matthews being like, oh, hold on, let me turn back around and go give Georgia another look. Or Jeremiah Smith like, oh, do I want to be a Buckeye? Maybe I need to go see what's up in Athens and see what's going on and find out why Dylan Raiola is going there and why he's not going to somewhere like Ohio State or Nebraska. Maybe I need to go give it a second look or a look in general. So it just changes things a lot. And it seems like Georgia is cooking now because of it.
And it changes things a lot. And one of the biggest reasons it changes things is it's that he's coming, but it's the fact that he's going to pick up his phone and say, hey, buddy, this is where I'm going. You should come catch passes from me.
That's all it takes is a phone call, right?
You got a guy that you want to play with. You call him up. And you say, hey, come on. We're building something special in Athens. You would really put us over the top if you come. The amount of stuff that we could do together if you come to Georgia, it's unlimited success that we could have. Like the amount of stuff that we could do together. So you get that aspect of it. And from what we're being told is he is picking up that phone. He is calling guys. He is definitely recruiting himself. And that's also what tells you that, yeah, we've got a little ways before signing day. He's still got to play football this fall as well. That tells you he's committed to Georgia, and he's really committed to Georgia because he is trying to get other guys to Georgia right now. That makes you feel good about his commitment, and I don't think that you're going to see him flip. I think he's the type of guy that once he actually made a commitment decision, that's what he was going to be doing. It would take a hell of a lot of stuff to somehow get him to change his mind, I think, at this point. And then, like we said, he's got the personal connections to Georgia, so I don't think it was a surprise to see him come to Georgia overall. I think all of that stuff started to tie in, and I think he's here. And like I said, he's making those phone calls, getting the guys to come play with him. I think you're somebody said this the other day, and they were like, "This is the most beatable Georgia team this year that you're going to have for a while because recruiting classes keep on stacking up." And they really
don't even look that beatable.
No, they don't look very beatable this year, but this is the most beatable football team that you're going to have in Athens for a while because these recruiting classes are really starting to stack up now. You get a quarterback like that on your roster. You, like we said a second ago, you still got Puglisi on your roster as well. One of those two quarterbacks are going to be very good, and you're going to get to see what those quarterbacks do. And shoot, you could get to see both because guess what? What we have learned, and I know this was a point of contention for a lot of Georgia fans early on, was that Kirby Smart couldn't handle the quarterback room. Guess what? He sure as crap can seem to handle it now, and he's keeping guys on the roster way longer than you expected. I expected somebody to potentially transfer last year after Stetson Bennett took the job. Everyone stuck around, and guess what? You're still getting big quarterback recruits. Theoretically, let's just say Raiola comes in and he plays. He doesn't start his freshman year. He starts the next 2 years. Well, guess what? Dylan Puglisi, he can redshirt 1 year and still have an extra 2 years of eligibility once Raiola's gone at that point. there's a lot of stuff that can be done. And if that's the case and you see that play out like we've kind of seen over the past couple of seasons at Georgia, where now Carson Beck is finally going to get his job this come fall, things could really get ugly for other teams out there but on the Georgia side just dominating. I mean, it can get ugly, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's just continues to be the Georgia show, and that's why we titled this episode what we did, because it's Georgia versus everyone. Everybody is pointing fingers at Georgia. Everybody's like, what is going on in Athens? And it kind of feels like the entire college football world is teaming up against Georgia. Like, what do we have to do to stop this? Like, what does it take? What do we got to do? Who's got to be the victim? Who's got to do this? And so everybody's trying to figure out, like, how do we stop this freight train?
Yeah.
Like, who's got to stand on the tracks and take the ball?
The other day I saw something, I think it was from the Baxter Street Boys, and they were commenting. Somebody, the original post was like, Georgia will blank in 2023. I think it was the Baxter Street Boys that posted on top of it. And they said, I don't know what Georgia's overall record's going to be, but whoever wins the national championship game next year is going to have to line up and beat Georgia at some point during next season. And I think that's a very accurate thing, whether it's in the playoffs in round one, if it's a national championship game, whoever's going to win that game is going to have to come they're going to come through Georgia at some point if they're going to do it. And that's the most like amazing thing to think about as a Georgia fan. Like, we've gotten to the point where we get to sit back and say that national championship trophy, the path is through Athens at this point. You've got to come through Georgia to take it from them, because if you don't come take it from them, they're going to run away with it. And it's a great team to be a fan of right now. We've waited our entire lives for this type of momentum and this type of success, and we're just the fruit is starting to completely grow at this point. And it's amazing.
Yep. And so a lot of buzz going on in Athens, rightfully so, and the fans are obviously flaunting their stuff like they should be after back-to-back titles, and now getting a play like Dylan Raiola, and now having the #1 recruiting class in the nation. But yeah, there's still people taking shots at Georgia. People are still finding ways to throw some shade at Georgia, if you will. And it comes from the media or social media in general. And there's now been this talk about Sanford Stadium again, which this is so funny to me, because this continues to be it's like a reoccurrence every so often. Like, it seems like Sanford Stadium becomes a topic yet again on Twitter. People are saying it's not elite. People are saying Georgia fans are not elite. Sanford Stadium's mid, yada, yada, yada. And it happened again this past weekend, or this past week, really. It's still going on. If you get on Twitter, people are still talking about it. And here's my whole thing is, like I said at the beginning of the show, I have been there for the Nooners. I have been there for Kent State at noon. Like, yep. Okay, yeah, it is what it is. It's Kent State. You don't really go in there juiced up or anything like that. Student section's there. They show up still a packed stadium. But typically by halftime, everybody's probably a lot of people are still going to be leaving the stadium, because, it's Kent State. But I've also been there for the 2019 Notre Dame game. And I've also been there for the 2022 Tennessee game, which unreal. That's best atmosphere I have ever been in myself. And I've been to the Ohio State game and also the national championship game. So, like, bar none, that game was the best. But even like 2019, when Notre Dame came into Athens,
that one was electric too. Yeah,
that one was electric. But even then, like, that crowd was very different compared to the one that was in Athens for 2022 against Tennessee. Those are two very different crowds, and I think that even speaks to the growth that has happened in the last 3 years. Like, a lot has changed in the fandom. I don't know what it was. You could say it's because of the national championships, or you can say it's because Kirby Smart has just changed the culture in Athens between everybody, not just his own players and his staff, but just everybody that associates himself with Georgia football. He's changed everything. I mean, you saw it when the first spring game, and there was 93,000 plus packed into Sanford Stadium for a friggin' spring game when it was 95 degrees. People were sweating bullets, but everybody wanted to be there to basically watch a glorified scrimmage. Like, everybody showed up for that. That was the start of it. But I think there's been even more change over the past 3 years. And I think that's why Sanford Stadium continues to be misunderstood. Because people, when you think about Sanford Stadium, you do think about 2013, 2014, those types of atmospheres maybe, or even before that, where it's like, yeah, like, Georgia's a good football team, but their fan base doesn't really show it in the stands. Whereas me, I know Sanford Stadium from the time that I was a student, which started in 2021, and like, that's how I know Sanford Stadium. And Sanford Stadium, to me, is one of the best atmospheres in college football. So I think there's a lot of non-recency bias towards Sanford Stadium because people haven't been going. So I'd say currently right now, Sanford Stadium is without a doubt one of the best atmospheres in college football. Like it is because those fans do show up. The atmosphere is electric. Like I will never forget standing in that student section until against Tennessee and it's pouring down rain. Like most times in that scenario, people are going to leave. Like Georgia seemingly had the game kind of in control. Like it looked like they were probably going to win, but everybody stayed in that stadium. The student sections, it's just off the chain. I just can't even describe it. It was just unreal. So that's just, in my opinion, kind of my experience in Sanford Stadium, like speaking to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree with you. And I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, some of the best environments that we've been in general. And I think I said that the best one that I've ever been a part of, it was the Tennessee game at Sanford Stadium. That environment, it was so crazy that when the rain started falling, everyone got louder. Everyone got a little crazier. I think it just kind of pushed everybody over the edge. And like you said, everybody kind of thought,
can't put this fire out.
No, everyone was like, hey, it's starting to rain. Is that going to calm the crowd down? No, it had the opposite effect. It was like putting gas on a fire because as soon as you did it, it got louder. The fans got more excited. Georgia started like extremely locking down Tennessee at that point, which made the fans go even crazier. It was the loudest that I've ever heard Sanford Stadium. I was at the Notre Dame game in 2019. The Arkansas game, that was a noon game at Georgia, which also hit like 112 decibels, I believe, at that point, which is insane for a noon game. You were talking about some of the nooners that sucked. Yeah, the UABs and the Kent States and stuff like that, the crowd doesn't necessarily get up for. But guess what? That stadium can be electric if it's needed at a noon game, because when Arkansas was coming in, Kirby Smart said, hey, need y'all in your seats when that game kicks off. I need y'all ready to go. And Georgia fans showed up for a noon game, and you could barely hear yourself talk and think at that one. So Georgia fans accept the call when it's upon them. So maybe they don't for a Kent State game at noon, but when it's an Arkansas game and it's a top 10 matchup at noon, they're going to show up for it, even though it's a noon game. A night game against Notre Dame, that environment definitely played a factor. It definitely had some impact on it. You get Tennessee at 3:30 and the rain starts falling, and it's the most electric environment that's ever been in Sanford Stadium in my lifetime. And I've gone to a lot of football games at Sanford Stadium. It's one of those, like you get Auburn at night. Those games are always really electric and really fun. When Georgia fans are needed, when the game calls for that type of environment, Sanford Stadium answers the call every single time. And like you said, it's a recency thing that it's really, really gotten that way. But part of that is because Georgia is now one of the better teams in the nation. So they're getting more focused. The fans are getting more excited. You got more and more people coming to the games and being louder because their team is in national contention. That's part of it. So yeah, in the next 5 years, at the rate that Georgia's going, I guarantee you people will not have that same conversation, because every single team that is worth a damn that comes through Athens is going to walk away saying, oh crap, yep, that's an environment. That's a loud one. That's a tough one to play in.
Tennessee until last year was probably like, that is not how I remember Sanford Stadium. Like that is not how I remember these folks being. That was different. So
you bring us a top 10 matchup, and it's going to be an environment that you are begging to get out of.
Yeah, and I think people just kind of hold Georgia maybe to a different standard when it comes to stadium atmospheres, because exactly what you said. Like people want to say like, oh, well, they only show up for the big games. Well, that's every school. Every school is going to show their best, is going to put their best foot forward in the big games when the top 10 matchups
when something's
roll into
on the
town.
line, when it feels like it really matters. Every game does matter for like college football right now. We get it, but when the games really matter and it's a top 10 matchup and it's do or die for your playoff hopes, of course the fans are going to get up for that.
Yeah. And of course, the fans aren't going to be as loud when a lesser team comes into town. Like that's just how it is. That's how every freaking team is.
Because you're expected to win.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I just think Sanford Stadium is misunderstood, and I think it gets a bad rap for no reason. And I think you just got to go and experience it yourself. Maybe when Ole Miss comes into Athens this year, maybe you can get a taste of what it's like, because that's probably going to be the biggest home game of the year. At least it's looking like the only likely option. So
I think that
would be my advice. If you can go hit up when Lane Kiffin comes into town, if you can go to that game, I would highly recommend it. Go get yourself a taste of Athens and a taste of the Sanford Stadium atmosphere, and go get you some of them dogs. That's what you got to do this year. So that is going to wrap it up for this week's episode. We covered a lot and a lot of variety, like a lot of different things. We got into some recruiting talk. We got into Sanford Stadium like we just did. And then also at the beginning of the episode, we talked about strength of schedule and why it's silly for you to be sitting there on Twitter talking about it in the month of May. So quit doing it. Just don't do it. Wait until the season's over to talk about strength of schedule, or you're at least halfway through the season to really dive into it. So that's just our 2 cents, and that's our recommendation for you as a fan. But keep on talking, keep on showing up for us as you guys did tonight. We had a great showing in the comment section. You guys were active the entire time, had some new faces. We appreciate that. You guys are elite, and I hope you think we are as well. Make sure to like and subscribe as you always do. That helps support us. That helps the channel grow. So do all of that before you head on out of here. And as always, Jeremiah, you get to do the honors of closing us out.
Keep it classy in the Classic City. We will catch you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Classic City Sports. Take a second to subscribe, rate, review, and share with your friends and family. Feel free to reach out to the Classic City Sports crew on Twitter with any topics you'd like discussed. You can reach out to Jeremiah at The Stodfather, to Jonathan at Dr._J Will, and make sure to follow at Classic City Pod for show updates. Check back next week for a brand new episode. In the meantime,